A late-night emergency turns into a nightmare when a black doctor arrives at a brutal crash scene, ready to save a life, only to be ignored by the very people trained to help. But when the unthinkable happens and time runs out, will they realize too late that the only person who can save the victim is the one they refuse to acknowledge? Dr. Vanessa Carter had seen her fair share of emergencies, but nothing prepared her for what she stumbled upon that night. She was exhausted, her body aching from an endless shift at Mercy General, where she'd spent the last 16 hours performing back-to-back surgeries. The only thing on her mind was getting home, taking a long shower, and collapsing into bed. But fate had other plans. It started with a streak of red and blue in her peripheral vision. Flashing lights ahead, a row of cars slowing down, the unmistakable sound of sirens and shouted orders. Her foot instinctively eased off the gas as she approached the scene. A black sedan had veered off the road, its front completely crushed against a tree. Smoke curled from the hood. Debris littered the pavement, the sickening crunch of metal against wood still fresh in the air. Vanessa's heart pounded. She knew the look of an accident that bad. Internal bleeding, crushed ribs, possible spinal injury. The kind of injuries where every second counted. She pulled onto the shoulder, her hands already reaching for her medical bag in the back seat. She barely had the door open when she heard it. "Man, keep moving." A police officer, white, stocky, mid-40s. His hand was raised, waving her off like she was just another rubbernecker slowing traffic. "I'm a doctor," she said quickly. "I can help." The officer barely spared her a glance. "We've got paramedics on the way, just keep moving." She gritted her teeth. This wasn't new to her. She'd been ignored, dismissed, overlooked more times than she could count. But this? A life-threatening situation, and they wouldn't even let her try? She stepped forward, clutching her bag tighter. "I don't think you understand. I'm a trauma surgeon. If that driver is still alive, they may not have time to wait for an ambulance." The officer's expression didn't change. "I said, keep moving." Another officer, younger, walked over. His name tag read, Henderson. He glanced between Vanessa and the wreckage. "What's going on?" "She says she's a doctor," the first officer muttered. "Trying to interfere." Vanessa inhaled sharply. "I'm trying to save a life." Henderson hesitated. He looked at the car, at the barely visible hand slumped over the driver's seat, and then back at her. For a split second, she thought he might step aside. But then, his face hardened. "Ma'am, this is an active emergency scene. Please step back." Vanessa clenched her jaw. The smell of burning rubber filled the air, the faintest whimper of pain carried from the wreck. She had to do something. A small crowd had started gathering near the barricades, whispering among themselves. She heard snippets. "Why won't they let her help? It doesn't matter, the EMTs will be here soon." But if she's a real doctor... Vanessa turned toward the wreckage, scanning for another way in. If she couldn't go through the officers, maybe... "Excuse me, you need to move." The sharp voice came from a paramedic, finally arriving on scene. Two men jumped out of the ambulance, pulling out gear. One of them, a tall, balding man in his 50s, frowned when he saw her standing there. "She's claiming she's a doctor," Henderson muttered to him. The paramedic glanced at her up and down, skepticism heavy in his expression. "What kind of doctor?" "Trauma surgeon," Vanessa snapped. "Mercy General." His face twitched, but the doubt remained. "We've got it covered." Her stomach twisted. She knew that look. The same look she'd seen on patients who refused to believe she was the attending, on colleagues who second-guessed her diagnosis, on hospital administrators who questioned if she was really the best candidate for the job. It was the look of someone who had already decided she didn't belong. Then, from the wreckage, a choked-out sound, a gurgle, a cough, something wet and strained. Vanessa's eyes snapped to the driver. The man was still alive, but barely. "Jesus, he's crashing," one of the paramedics muttered, rushing forward. She watched as they scrambled to pull him out, but something was wrong. The way his body slumped, the erratic way his chest moved. Then she saw it. His trachea is shifting, she blurted out. The paramedic hesitated. He's got a tension pneumothorax, she continued. If you don't decompress his chest now, he'll be dead before you get him to the hospital. The older paramedic, the one who had dismissed her, faltered. His eyes darted to the patient. He knew she was right. But he didn't move. Vanessa stepped forward. I can do it. The hesitation stretched unbearably long. Finally, the younger paramedic, clearly newer, looked at his partner. Bill, we don't have time. Bill exhaled through his nose. He looked at Vanessa again, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he handed her a needle. Vanessa didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, she dropped to her knees beside the unconscious man, her hands steady, her mind laser. She found the second intercostal space, the telltale bulging of the chest. She plunged the needle in. A rush of air escaped with a hiss. The man's chest rose, his breathing evening just slightly. Vanessa looked up, her heart hammering. You need to get him to the ER now. For the first time, no one argued. The paramedics loaded the man onto the stretcher, their movements fast and efficient. As they lifted him into the ambulance, Bill finally spoke. You coming? Vanessa blinked. He met her eyes. You just saved his life. If he codes again on the way, we'll need you. The shift was almost imperceptible. The same men who had ignored her minutes ago were now looking at her like she was their best chance. She nodded, climbed into the ambulance, and grabbed the patient's hand. She didn't know who he was. Didn't know if he was important or just another guy who made a mistake on the road. But what she did know? He'd almost died tonight. Not just because of the crash, but because the people who were supposed to save him had refused to see the one person who could. The moment Vanessa climbed into the ambulance, the mood shifted. No more dismissiveness, no more second-guessing. Now all eyes were on her, waiting for instructions. The patient's breathing was still shallow, but at least he was breathing. For now. Keep bagging him, she ordered the younger paramedic, who immediately obeyed. His oxygen saturation needs to stay above 90% if we want a chance at stabilizing him at the hospital. The ambulance rumbled to life, sirens screaming as it sped toward the nearest trauma center. The dim fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting harsh shadows on the patient's bloodied face. Vanessa leaned over him, assessing the damage. Multiple deep lacerations, possible internal bleeding, a left-sided rib fracture judging by the way his chest wall caved in slightly. But the real problem was his blood pressure. It was tanking fast. He's hypotensive, she muttered, reaching for the IV bag. We need fluids, wide open. Bill, the paramedic who had initially dismissed her at the scene, hesitated for only a second before grabbing the saline and setting up a rapid infusion. It was a small thing, a minor act of compliance, but it meant everything. A few minutes ago, he wouldn't even acknowledge her as a doctor. Now, he was following her lead. But she didn't have time to dwell on that. The patient's condition was deteriorating. His blood pressure was still dropping, and his breathing was becoming erratic again. The needle decompression had bought them time, but she had a sinking feeling that his lung was still collapsing. Damn it, she muttered under her breath. She needed to place a chest tube, right now. She turned to Bill. Do you have a 36 French chest tube? His brows furrowed. Yeah, but... Hand it to me, she cut in, her voice firm. He didn't argue this time. He grabbed the sealed chest tube kit and passed it to her. She ripped it open, snapping on sterile gloves. The ambulance jostled violently as they hit a pothole, but her hands remained steady. She'd done this hundreds of times before. She found the right intercostal space, made a small incision with the scalpel, and carefully inserted the tube. The moment she connected it to the drainage system, another rush of air escaped. The patient's chest visibly expanded, and then his vitals improved. Breathing is stabilizing, the younger paramedic announced, relief evident in his voice. Vanessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But they weren't out of the woods yet. She glanced up at Bill. "What's his name?" He checked the man's wallet, which had been placed in a small evidence bag. "James Miller." Something about the name tickled at Vanessa's brain, but she didn't have time to focus on it. The ambulance sped through the city streets, closing in on the hospital. Every second felt stretched, time warping between each bump in the road. James was stable for now, but his abdomen was distending. Internal bleeding? She pressed lightly against his stomach and felt the telltale rigidity. He needed surgery. Fast. "How far out are we?" she asked, her voice sharp. 2 minutes, the driver called back. Not soon enough. Vanessa grabbed a syringe and drew out a small sample of blood from James's femoral vein. Dark, almost black. That meant only one thing. His oxygen levels were dangerously low, and his blood was becoming acidotic. She clenched her jaw. They needed to move faster. Bill must have noticed the tension in her posture because he asked, "What else can we do?" Vanessa swallowed her initial response to remind him that she'd been trying to help from the beginning, that if they'd let her assess James at the crash site, he'd already be in an OR by now. But she didn't have the luxury of resentment right now. She needed a team. Keep an eye on his blood pressure. If his systolic drops below 80, start a second line and push more fluids. Bill nodded, suddenly serious. The ambulance lurched to a stop in front of the ER bay. The doors flew open and a trauma team was already waiting. 34-year-old male motor vehicle collision, Vanessa announced as they wheeled James out. Tension pneumo decompressed in the field, chest tube placed. Hypotensive, likely hemorrhaging internally. He needs the OR now. The trauma team, led by Dr. Emily Waters, one of Vanessa's colleagues, sprang into action. "I'll scrub," Vanessa said, moving toward the hospital entrance. But before she could follow, a hand grabbed her wrist. She turned to find Bill staring at her, his grip surprisingly gentle. He exhaled, looking uncomfortable. "I should have listened to you earlier." Vanessa blinked. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked inside, already shifting her focus back to the patient. She didn't have time for wounded egos. All that mattered was saving James's life, and proving to herself more than anyone that no amount of doubt or dismissal could stop her from doing what she was born to do. The harsh fluorescent lights of the operating room bore down on Vanessa as she guided the scalpel through James Miller's abdomen. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors filled the air, punctuated only by the quiet voices of the surgical team responding to her commands. "Retractor." A nurse placed the instrument in her hand. Vanessa's gloved fingers worked quickly, moving aside layers of tissue, searching for the source of the bleed. There it was, a lacerated liver. She had seconds, maybe minutes, before he bled out completely. Suction. The surgical tech complied, clearing the pooling blood. Clamps. She worked methodically, sealing off the bleeding vessels with precision. Time blurred around her. It always did in the OR. Outside these walls, she was constantly battling assumptions, proving herself, demanding to be seen. But in here, she was in complete control. A voice broke through her focus. BP stabilizing. The tension in her shoulders eased, but she didn't allow herself to relax. Not yet. She placed the last suture, checking her work one final time before nodding. "We're good. Let's close." Her team moved seamlessly, sewing the incision with the practiced ease of people who had done this 1,000 times before. When they finished, Vanessa stepped back, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. James was alive. She stripped off her gloves and gown, tossing them into the bin as she exited the OR. The rush of cold air in the hallway hit her immediately, but it did little to cool the fire still burning in her chest. The entire night replayed in her mind. Being dismissed at the crash scene, fighting to be taken seriously, proving herself only when a man's life was slipping away. She should feel victorious. Instead, she felt exhausted. She walked toward the waiting area, where a group of people stood, some in police uniforms, others in street clothes. Among them was Officer Henderson, the cop who had told her to step back. His eyes met hers. He hesitated. Then, without a word, he nodded. It was stiff, awkward, but it was an acknowledgement. Vanessa wasn't sure how to feel about that. Before she could dwell on it, another figure stepped forward. A woman in her 60s, dressed in an elegant navy gold blazer. "Dr. Carter?" Vanessa recognized the look in her eyes before she even spoke. "Is he okay?" She was James Miller's mother. Vanessa softened slightly. "He's stable. We were able to stop the bleeding and repair the damage. He's not out of the woods yet, but his chances are good." The woman let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what we would have done if—" She cut herself off, her gaze flickering toward the police officers standing nearby. Vanessa knew what she was thinking. If Vanessa hadn't been there, if they had kept ignoring her, if James had died while help was standing right in front of him. She could see the weight of that realization settling in the older woman's face. James Miller wasn't just anyone. He was a respected businessman, a donor to multiple community programs, a man with influence, the kind of person people paid attention to. And now, his near-half experience had been witnessed by more than just those at the scene. It had been recorded. The video had already made its way online. She knew because her phone wouldn't stop buzzing in her pocket. People were talking. Vanessa Carter, black trauma surgeon, ignored at an accident scene until it was almost too late. The footage showed everything. The way she was dismissed, the way the officers and paramedics refused to listen, the moment they finally realized their mistake, and now the public was reacting. She knew what was coming. Outrage, statements from officials, some empty apology about how this was a misunderstanding, calls for change, followed by silence when the news cycle moved on. She had seen it happen before. And yet, when she looked at James Miller's mother, she saw something different. She saw guilt. Not just the guilt of almost losing her son, but the guilt of knowing that if it had been someone else, someone without status, the outcome might have been different. "Dr. Carter," she said carefully, "is there anything I can do to make this right?" The question hung in the air. Vanessa knew what she was asking. Not just about her son, but about the system that had almost cost him his life. And for the first time that night, Vanessa allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. She had saved a man who, moments earlier, people had assumed she wasn't qualified to help. She had proven them wrong. But why had she needed to? Why had her ability to save a life been questioned in the first place? She could feel every eye on her, waiting for an answer. She exhaled slowly. Start by asking yourself why it took your son being on that stretcher for you to see me. James's mother swallowed, her face tightening, and Vanessa left it at that. Because at the end of the day, she wasn't looking for thanks. She wasn't looking for apologies. She was looking for change. And maybe, just maybe, this time people would finally start to listen.